When the First World War began, the Ottoman Empire had been losing power and territories for more than 100 years. Once a great military power that ruled over many countries, it was called the Sick Man of Europe by Tsar Nicholas of Russia in the middle of the 19th century. In 1915, Ottoman authorities ordered a deliberate genocide and murdered some 600,000 to more than 1 million Armenians. What were the preconditions to these massacres? And how did the Turkish population turn against its Armenian minority? At the end of the 19th century, Turkey was commercially and industrially backward and dominated in these realms by other nations. In 1875, the Ottoman Empire went bankrupt. A public debt administration was set up by the great powers to control Turkey's finances, and 12 to 15% of Turkey's revenues were ceded to this organization. Within the Ottoman Empire, commerce, trade, and finance were largely in the hands of foreigners or non-Muslim minorities such as Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. The Ottoman Empire and foreign nations signed capitulations, which were extraterritorial agreements that granted judicial and economic privileges to foreigners. They were exempt from all taxes except export and import duties. Foreign products flooded into Turkey, inhibiting industrial development. Foreign powers continuously exerted influence on the Ottoman Empire, both military and political. Russia was consistently belligerent, partly because it wanted to acquire new territories and reduce Turkish power. England's prime concern was the containment of Russia. In exchange for promises of reform, England supported Turkey in its conflict with Russia. In the year 1877, after the Balkan Uprising, a war broke out that was supported by the Russian Empire. The Russian-led coalition won the war, pushing the Ottomans back all the way to the gates of Constantinople, leading to the intervention of the Western European great powers. As a result, Russia succeeded in claiming provinces in the Caucasus, namely Kars and Batum, and also annexed the Bujak region. The principalities of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, each of which had had de facto sovereignty for some years, formally proclaimed independence from the Ottoman Empire. This was a large humiliation for the Turks, who continued to gradually lose their influence on all fronts. In order to secure his power, the circumstance led to Sultan seeking an explanation which he could give to his subjects, the cause of all the problems. Armenians were a perfect target for such a scapegoat strategy. For centuries, the great mountain plateau of eastern Anatolia, in present-day eastern Turkey, was inhabited primarily by Christian Armenians who shared the area with Muslim Kurds. Armenians retained a strong sense of communal identity, however, embodied in the Armenian language and the Armenian Church. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were about 2.5 million Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire. A significant number of Armenians also lived beyond the eastern border of the Ottoman Empire, in territory held by Russia. Armenians were portrayed as enemies who plotted behind the back of Sultan, the evil that did not let the Ottoman Empire return to its former glory. The Ottoman authorities increased their repression of Armenians, raising taxes on Armenian villages, and arousing nationalistic feelings and resentment against Armenians among the neighboring Kurds. When, in 1894, the Armenians in the Sassoon region refused to pay an oppressive tax, Ottoman troops and Kurdish tribesmen killed thousands of them and burned their villages. Another wave of killing began in September 1895, when the Ottoman authorities' repression of an Armenian protest in Istanbul turned into a massacre. The incident was followed by a series of massacres in towns with Armenian communities that culminated in December 1895, when nearly 3,000 Armenians who had taken refuge in the Cathedral of Urfa, modern Sanliurfa, were burned alive. In the hope of calling attention to their cause, Armenian revolutionaries staged another demonstration in 1896, seizing the Ottoman Bank in Istanbul. In the mayhem that followed, more than 5,000 Armenians were killed by mobs of Muslim Turks whose actions were apparently coordinated by government troops. After 1896, the Armenian oppression was reduced. Murdering thousands of Armenians did not solve the economic and political issues of the empire. If anything, it only contributed to the further degradation of the Ottoman system. The years of hardship resulted in a desire for change among the Turkish population. In 1908, a revolution compelled Abdul Hamid, who was a sultan at the time, to restore constitutional government. Abdul Hamid was a cruel leader who became known for the massacres of Armenians described earlier. He established the Ottoman secret police, which he used to silence dissent and the revolutionary movements. In 1908, the revolutionaries, who called themselves the Committee of Union and Progress, but who are also known as the Young Turks, gained complete power and overthrew the Sultan. Initially, the revolution was widely welcomed. The Young Turks promised universal rights, freedom, and quality. A long-wanted change for the population living in constant misery for years. However, political disorder, internal upheavals, internal violence, especially against Armenians, and losing wars continued. Nevertheless, the Young Turks retained power. 3 months after their revolution, on October 5, 1908, Bulgaria proclaimed complete independence, and in the Balkan Wars, between 1911 and 1913, the Ottoman Empire lost Greece and Albania. By 1913, it was effectively eliminated from Europe. Poverty, hunger, disease, and influx of refugees from lost territories and their conflict with minorities added to life problems. The loss of provinces in Europe caused substantial migration of Muslims into Turkey, especially Anatolia. There was a conflict between the newly arriving Muslims and Armenians living in the territories that they had moved into. After the revolution, strife between Armenians and Young Turks further contributed to political instability and violence. Probably to a large degree as a result of these conditions, an ideology of pan-Turkism or Turanism became dominant. Its aim was to enhance the power of the Ottoman Empire and to purify the nation, making it Turkish in language, customs, and religion. The Young Turks abandoned the alliance with England in response to political and material support from Germany, in the hope of regaining lost territories or conquering new ones. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany. Immediately, it suffered heavy losses to a massive Russian invasion. The Ottoman Empire was too weak to keep up with all the other major powers. The only meaningful victory by the Ottoman Empire was achieved on the Gallipoli Peninsula, where 315,000 Turkish soldiers defeated a 490,000 allied army of the British and French empires. The lack of resources did not allow Ottomans to build up from that victory, and soon they began losing ground once again. The optimism gained from the victory at Gallipoli was replaced by a gathering sense of despair, and the British remained on the offensive in the Middle East for the rest of the war. During the war, the people experienced much hardship. Agricultural methods were primitive, and the yield was poor. Peasants had difficulty paying their taxes and lived in many areas in houses without sanitation. The peasants had feudal obligations to landlords and were forced to serve in the army, where they were poorly fed, rarely paid, and kept in active service beyond the legal period. Cholera epidemics continued until the end of the century. 18% of the Muslim population in Anatolia died during World War I from starvation and diseases, as well as fighting. 2/3 of the dead were civilians. These were the circumstances in which the genocide of the Armenians began in 1915. The loss of power, prestige, and influence as a nation, and the tremendous life problems within Turkey, had resulted in powerful feelings of frustration and threat in both the people and the leaders, and gave rise to the needs and motives that led a group to turn against a subgroup of society. The devaluation of Armenians had several sources. First, the Ottomans devalued and mistreated all their subject peoples. The concept of Raja, or cattle, was applied to them. The non-Muslim subjects of the Sultan had been reduced to such a condition of servitude that the idea of their being placed on a footing of equality with their Muslim rulers seemed unthinkable. Preserved merely as taxpayers necessary to supply the funds for the maintenance of the dominant and military class, they had been so degraded and oppressed that they dared not look a Turk in the face. Their only value was from a fiscal point of view. For a long time, Christians were forbidden to own guns or ride horses. The possession of a gun was a serious crime. They had to pay extra taxes and board migratory Kurdsmen who beat their hosts, raped their daughters, and looted their property. The Armenians in particular were constant prey. At international conferences, they repeatedly requested protection from the violence of Kurds and Circassians. After the Balkan Wars, the Armenians were the only large Christian minority left, a potential target for scapegoating and violence. In some ways, the Turkish image of the Armenians was strikingly similar to the German image of Jews. The two minorities had a similar status in society and had developed in similar ways over centuries of persecution. Armenians were seen as low character, cunning and treacherous, and as parasites and exploiters who plotted against Turks. In post-war Turkish writings, the Armenians are described as instruments of foreign agitation. tools of the European powers, an avenue for their mingling in the internal affairs of Turkey, and for pursuing their designs on the empire. Armenians were victims of a progression of increasing destructiveness. They were devalued because of their religion and inferior status as subject people. They were resented because of their financial, commercial, and administrative success. They provoked hostility by their attempts to protect themselves and to gain greater rights and autonomy. Their religion, commercial involvement, and attempts to gain outside support linked them to foreign powers, especially Russia. Armenians were subject to many forms of discrimination, brutality, and murder on increasing scales. There was a strong nationalistic element in the Young Turks movement and a nationalistic component in their ideology. Young Turks wanted to restore the glory of the Ottoman Empire. To ensure their dominance, the Young Turks were ready to use power ruthlessly. According to some, they brutalized political life. They successfully mobilized the people, held mass meetings, and organized effective boycotts of foreign goods. New visions set new goals: the creation of a single pure and homogeneous Turkic culture and an empire that would unite all the Turkic peoples, a worthy successor to the late Ottoman Empire. The Young Turks feared that the Armenians might succeed in creating an independent state in eastern Anatolia, which would form a barrier between the Ottoman Turks and Turkic people to the east and destroy the possibility of a new empire. Greater Turkishness, national cultural purity, and the creation of a new empire were to re-establish a feeling of unity and positive identity in Turks, including the Young Turk leaders themselves. In January 1915, Enver Pasha attempted to push back the Russians at the Battle of Sarıkamış, only to suffer the worst Ottoman defeat of the war. Although poor generalship and harsh conditions were the main reasons for the loss, the Young Turk government sought to shift the blame to Armenian treachery. Armenian soldiers and other non-Muslims in the army were demobilized and transferred into labor battalions. The disarmed Armenian soldiers were then systematically murdered by Ottoman troops, the first victims of what would become genocide. At about the same time, irregular forces began to carry out mass killings in Armenian villages near the Russian border. Soon after the defeat at Sarıkamış, the Ottoman government began to deport Armenians from eastern Anatolia on the grounds that their presence near the front lines posed a threat to national security. In May, the Ottoman Parliament passed legislation formally authorizing the deportation. Throughout summer and autumn of 1915, Armenian civilians were removed from their homes and marched through the valleys and mountains of eastern Anatolia toward desert concentration camps. The deportation, which was overseen by civil and military officials, was accompanied by a systematic campaign of mass murder carried out by irregular forces, as well as by local Kurds and Circassians. Survivors who reached the deserts of Syria languished in concentration camps. Many starved to death, and massacres continued into 1916. Conservative estimates have calculated that some 600,000 to more than 1 million Armenians were slaughtered or died on the marches. The events of 1915-16 were witnessed by a number of foreign journalists, missionaries, diplomats, and military officers who sent reports home about death marches and killing fields. Abraham Hartunian, an Armenian pastor who survived both the killings of 1894-96 and the genocide of 1915-16, wrote, "On Sunday morning, November 3rd, 1895, the church bells were silent. The churches and schools, desecrated and plundered, lay in ruins. The Armenian houses, robbed and empty, were as caves. 1,500 men had been slaughtered, and those left alive were wounded and paralyzed. Girls were in the shame of their rape." The Naim Andonian documents outline a radical solution to the lingering Turco-Armenian conflict. The documents show secret orders from various ministers. All Armenians were to be killed, and the responsibility was fully assumed by the government. The designated officials are assured that they will not be held accountable. Officials who stall are threatened with sanctions. Some telegrams exhort functionaries to show no mercy to women, children, or the sick, and to dispose of Armenian orphans who were retained by Muslim families. Armin T. Wegener, a German eyewitness, wrote to President Wilson, "And so they drove the whole people, men, women, hoary elders, children, and expectant mothers into the Arabic desert, with no other object than to let them starve to death. They drove the people out of towns at all hours of the day and night. They burned the villages, destroyed the churches, or turned them into mosques. Even before the gates of Aleppo, they were not allowed to rest. The shrunken parties were ceaselessly driven barefooted hundreds of miles under the burning sun, enfeebled by fever and other maladies. Here they died, slain by Kurds, robbed by gendarmes, shot, hanged, poisoned, starved. The Armenian genocide laid the ground for the more homogeneous nation-state that eventually became the Republic of Turkey. By the end of the war, more than 90% of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were gone, and many traces of their former presence had been erased. The deserted homes and property of the Armenians in eastern Anatolia were given to Muslim refugees, and surviving women and children were often forced to give up their Armenian identities and convert to Islam. Tens of thousands of orphans, however, found some refuge in the protection of foreign missionaries. Turkey has steadily refused to recognize that the events of 1915 to 1916 constitute genocide, even though most historians have concluded that the deportations and massacres do fit the definition of genocide, the intentional killing of an ethnic or religious group. While the Turkish government and allied scholars have admitted that deportations took place, they maintain that the Armenians were a rebellious element that had to be pacified during a national security crisis. In 2014, government officials in Turkey offered condolences to the Armenian victims, but Armenians remained committed to having the killings during World War I recognized as a genocide.